on time so that we can finish by 2 this afternoon. For our meeting today, each of you has a packet containing the agenda for today's meeting, minutes from our meeting on September 10th, the bios of our presenters from outside the coordinating board, hard copies of presentations and handouts, and a document entitled Goals with Possible Targets, Indicators, and Strategies for the Next Higher Education Plan. We'll be using this document during our working lunch and our facilitated small group discussions this afternoon. Coordinating board staff assembled this document to stimulate our discussions about the possible goals for the plan, related measurable targets that will define the state's progress toward meeting these goals, and related strategies designed for goal accomplishment. I also want to call your attention to a document at your places regarding some potentially workable meeting dates for our upcoming meetings. As you can see, we only have one date in December, so we'll just have to see what level of attendance we can achieve to see whether that's workable at all for December. Please indicate your availability by circling the dates and turn it over to either Mary Smith or Mary Mitchell before you leave, if possible. The meeting dates of our committee will be forthcoming to you by email as soon as the coordinating board staff can compare our responses and determine the meeting dates that work best for most of us. Also at your places is a still draft agenda for the 2014 Texas Higher Education Leadership Conference, Planning Educationally for a Competitive Global Economy, that would be held November 2021 at the Doubletree in Austin, and I encourage you to attend day 2 if you can. I know everybody has busy schedules. Presentations and discussions regarding the potential goals, targets, and strategies for the new higher education plan will be the focus of panel discussions and workshops on the morning of the 21st. As you're aware, a draft of the proposed higher education plan is scheduled to be considered by the coordinating board in July 2015. But before that, the goal is to provide opportunity for key stakeholders, including regents, trustees, chancellors, presidents, and other higher education leaders to provide input into the proposed plan. In terms of our agenda for today, after the approval of the minutes from our September 10th meeting, we will hear from Dr. Suzanne Mettler, as professor of American institutions in the Department of Government at Cornell University. Dr. Mettler will share her perspective on how our U.S. system of higher education has gone from facilitating upward mobility to exacerbating social inequality, and what higher education policymakers can do to more effectively facilitate higher education access and opportunity for future generations. After our discussions with Dr. Mettler, we will hear from Thomas Babel, Vice President for Regulatory Affairs of the DeFry Education Group, share his perspective on how the for-profit sector of higher education is contributing to increasing the post-secondary attainment levels of our population. And directly after Mr. Babel's presentation and our discussions with him, we'll take a short break to retrieve our lunches before breaking into our small discussion groups. Coordinating board staff have set up 4 small group discussion areas here in the boardroom. So after getting your lunch, please simply find your table and we'll meet separately in these groups. Each group will discuss one of the 4 proposed goals that are summarized in the Goals and Possible Targets and Strategies document included in your packet of materials. Each group will meet for just over an hour before we reconvene as a whole so that each group can report to the full committee on its discussions and recommendations. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes of our September 10th meeting? Made a second. Made a second. Any opposed? Minutes pass. Thank you. Finally, before I introduce Dr. Mettler, I wanted to remind you that we've been looking to the future to determine a strategic plan that inspires and advances student success, and a plan that will help position Texas as a leader in an increasingly complex world economy. Each of our meetings has had a strategic focus and has featured experts from higher education and the workforce. So far, we've considered an overall state goal, completion goal, a workforce marketable skills goal, and student cost, student debt goal. We will be considering those goals again today. So with that, unless members have any questions, I'd like to begin the discussions by introducing Dr. Mettler. Her more detailed biography is in your packet of materials, but for those of you who've joined us via the web, Dr. Mettler is the Clinton Rossetter Professor of American Institutions in the Government department at Cornell University. Her research and teaching interests include public policy, political behavior, civic engagement, and inequality. Prior to joining the faculty at Cornell University in 2007, Dr. Mettler was a distinguished professor, Department of Political Science at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. She's the author of numerous articles and books on public policy. Her most recent book, Degrees of Inequality: How Higher Education Politics Sabotage the American Dream. She is a fellow at the Century Foundation, and she is on the board of the Scholar Strategy Network. Holds a PhD in government from Cornell, and I'd like to welcome Dr. Mettler.
Good morning.
Yeah.
I hope you can see me okay.
We can. Hopefully you can see us.
Joining you remotely from upstate New York. I'm delighted to be with you this morning, and I hope that I can be of some help to you as you conduct your work. My work is broadly about all sorts of public policies, but I've been studying contemporary public policy around higher ed for the past 8 years or so, coming at it as a bit of an outsider, I think. I hope that the perspective that I've gained could be of some use to you. What you're seeing right now is the cover of my book that came out this past spring. I got started on this book because previously I had done a study of the World War II GI Bill, which of course sent so many veterans to college or on for vocational training after World War II. And here you have some of them registering for college at Indiana University. I love the exuberant looks on their faces. The GI Bill was the first of several public policies in the middle of the 20th century that helped to really expand access to college for Americans across the income spectrum. So we had the GI Bill and from the federal government, and later federal financial aid policies that extended aid to civilian students as well, the National Defense Education Act, Higher Education Act, and Pell Grants. And then at the same time, state governments were investing more than ever in their public universities and colleges. And because of this, the rate of growth of the number of Americans with college degrees was really immense over that time period. We went from young Americans having just 1 in 20 having a college degree in 1940 on the eve of World War II to 1977 when 1 in 4 of that same young adult age group had a 4-year college degree. So it was really a tremendous period during which Americans came to think of higher education as an institution or a set of institutions that helped to provide upward mobility. So my question as I started this project was, what has happened since that time? And to cut to the chase, the conclusion I have come to is that today in higher ed, we have increasing stratification of separate and unequal tiers, that no longer is higher education this set of institutions that provides upward mobility, but rather in many ways it's reinforcing and in some ways even widening economic inequality. Of course, we've seen the rise of economic inequality in the United States since the 1970s, but I think that people still assume that higher ed would help to mitigate that for those who had the chance to go to college. But looking at this carefully, while I still think that that works for some individuals, it's not working well for many people. And I try to look at the sources of this, and I ultimately say that it's very much a political failure. Certainly there are many sources, but I think we have not acknowledged previously the extent to which we have a political failure on our hands. So first, let me just go over the trends briefly about what's happening. If you look at this graph, it shows you that for Americans who are today in their late 50s and early 60s.
Dr. Mettler, can I ask you a question? Your PowerPoint is not displaying.
Oh, excuse me?
Your PowerPoint is not displaying here, so I don't know if there's anything you can do at your end to.
Okay, wait a second. So if I go back to Skype and then go to all, share screens, and start. Do you see that? Oh, okay. Do you see it now? Bigger?
It is available on paper.
Okay.
Oh, this is a shame. Well, I don't know the answer to this.
Your paper copies and not worry about it, so we can go ahead and hear you, and rather than figuring out the technology. So we're fine here.
Okay. Dr. Miller, why don't you go ahead? We've got it, and at least some of us
Okay,
do.
so you'll use my paper copies instead.
It's in my, it's the left side of your packet.
That's
Right
okay.
behind the middle.
Yeah, it's the left side of your packet.
Okay.
Sorry for the interruption.
We should now be looking at the graph that's entitled No Longer the International Leader. Okay. So does everyone have that?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. So so if you look over on the left, the United States, you'll see that of Americans who are today in their late 50s and early 60s, that they were the most highly educated of their cohort group around the world. But if you look at young Americans who are ages 25 to 34, you'll see that there's not much of an increase in terms of their college graduation rates with four-year college degrees. Meanwhile, however, about 10 other countries have leapfrogged over us. Now, if you go on to the next slide, inequality in college degrees, what you'll see here is who is getting college degrees today compared to the 1970s. Now, there have been increases among all income groups, but the biggest increases are among those who grow up in the top quartile of the income distribution, among whom 71% of young people now get a four-year college degree by age 24. However, for other Americans, the increases are not all that impressive, particularly for people below median income. It's still only 1 in 10 Americans in the bottom income quartile who get a college degree by that point in time, a four-year degree, and only 15% of those in the second quartile. Now, if you turn to the next table, stratification of colleges, I think that today the concern is not just whether a young person goes to college or not, but what the outcomes are, whether they graduate, how much in debt they are. And here we find that it really matters where a young person attends college. There's a lot of different numbers on this table, and I'm not going to go over all of these. But what I would highlight for you is that if you look at the bottom row, public universities and colleges are still the best deal in town in terms of their relatively low tuition, although it's increased dramatically over time, and that's a hardship for low to middle income people. But nonetheless, it's much lower than the other two levels. And many young people today are turning to the for-profits, which have been, over the past couple of decades, the fastest growing sector of higher education. But their college graduation rates are low by comparison, about 22%. Most students who attend them borrow a much higher rate than the publics, as well as the private nonprofits, of course, and they borrow a great deal, and their default rates are very high. So in other words, our problems today range from whether or not a person goes to college to where they attend and what their likelihood is of graduating, the level of debt they take on, and whether they're able to use that degree to repay their debt. So what I do in this book is to try to grapple with why is all of this happening? And I'm a political scientist, and I understand the world through these kinds of lenses. And what I've really come up with is this idea that today we still have on the books policies that were created in the past, many of them during the middle of the 20th century. So now I'm looking at the slide, what explains it, okay, the policy scape. Today we have these policies created in the past, but they're not continuing to function as well as they once did. Policies over time need maintaining and updating, or they can go off the rails. The former Senator from Kansas, Nancy Kassebaum, who was a moderate Republican serving Congress in the 1980s and 90s, she said to me when I interviewed her, public programs, like any programs, need to be managed. And she doesn't feel that's happening as effectively today as it was in the past. And as a result of that, policies can have all of these effects that such that they don't work the way they should have. And if we turn to the next slide, what I'm saying here is that our contemporary political circumstances are a particularly bad match with these existing policies or policy-scape because they make it very difficult to engage in this kind of maintenance. And this owes both to the high levels of partisan polarization, particularly in Washington, D.C., but in many state legislatures as well, and also to what I'm calling plutocracy, or responsiveness of the political system to powerful vested interests that have plenty of resources, who manage to still get their voices heard while the American public at large feels that government is in a stalemate and not responding to them. So now very briefly, I know that you are interested today particularly in the for-profits. That's really just one piece of the story I tell, but I'll focus on that more today than the other parts. But I want to briefly mention the other parts because it helps to put the larger story in context. So if you turn to the next sheet, diminishing opportunity in federal student aid. The irony in federal student aid today is that we're actually spending more money than ever, but we don't seem to be spending it very effectively to increase college graduation rates. And there's a variety of reasons for this. This particular sheet that I'm showing you shows with the dotted line that the cost of attending a four-year public university, the tuition, room and board, has gone up dramatically over time in real terms. But Pell Grants, which are the bottom line, have not escalated as quickly. In fact, they fell behind for many years in real terms. Recently, they've been increased, but whereas back in the 1970s when they were created, Pell Grants paid for 80% of the cost of tuition, room, and board at the average four-year public university. Today, they only pay for about 31% of that. So what students have had to do instead is to turn to student loans and to borrow large amounts of money, increasing amounts over time. And that's what the top line is indicating. So that's one of the major developments with student aid that's occurred. And, you know, we have new kinds of student aid, particularly through the tax system of tuition tax credits. But these, in fact, predominantly help students who would go to college anyway and don't actually do much to increase college attendance by lower income people because of the way they're delivered. The second major trend I show in the book is that public universities and colleges have had sinking support from states. Now, this is really the big story, of course, because 73% of American college students attend these schools, and state spending on average across the states has declined per student by 26% between 1990 and 2010 in real terms. Well, and that's meant that these institutions have to do something to make ends meet. And so they've done a couple of things. For one thing, they've increased tuition. And this means that students and their families are bearing more of that burden, and it makes it much harder for low to middle income people to attend because it's such a great share now of people's incomes, which have not increased by the same rate over time. It also means that colleges and universities have had to scale back on what they can offer students in terms of academic support services. They've needed to put more students in the classroom per professor. They've turned increasingly to using online classes. And it turns out that all of those changes are detrimental to college graduation rates. So we have this problem today that more people than ever are enrolling in college, but college graduation rates are really poor. And it seems to be very much related to the shrinking resources, as well as higher tuition. Now, I thought that you might be interested in this next slide, and I'm afraid you're probably looking at a black and white copy of it, so you can't really tell what these different lines are. The lines actually line up from top to bottom with the codes on the right-hand side, so I hope that helps you. The line that is second to the bottom is higher education. And as you can see, it's been pretty flat in terms of the spending over time by states on a per capita basis. These are all per capita measures. But all of the other commitments by states have increased over time. The K-12 education spending, Medicaid spending, and prison spending. And all of those things have been squeezing out what states can spend on higher ed. And the top line is tax revenues, which had been going up but have been flat over the past decade. And this, I did find that states that have continued to increase their tax revenues have not faced this trade-off between their spending for higher ed and these other mandatory parts of their budgets. Higher ed, of course, is disadvantaged because it's the largest discretionary item in state budgets, and all of these other areas of spending increases are mandatory, and states have a real difficulty there. But now turning to the rise of the for-profit colleges. Enrollment in the for-profits increased quite dramatically over time, and this shows you in actual numbers. And as a percentage of students enrolled in colleges, it went from under 2% in the early 90s to being something around 10% now. Interestingly, both Democrats and Republicans in Washington, even in this era of high partisan polarization, do come together. Many of them come together to support much of our federal student aid today going to the for-profit colleges. Today, 1 in 4 federal student aid dollars goes to the for-profit colleges. So the question is, why do we see this kind of agreement? Democrats will defend the for-profit colleges because they'll say that they are promoting opportunity. But in fact, I find the statistics less than compelling on this. The graduation rates are about 22%. Most students who attend them borrow to do so. Those who do graduate with bachelor's degrees, 94% of them have borrowed, which is the highest median rate of any of the sectors. And what they borrow is $33,000 as the median rate. They account for 47% of all student loan defaults. And of students who are their graduates, 23% default within 3 years. Now, this student loan debt is not excusable in bankruptcy. So for many of these low-income people who attend, in fact, they end up worse off than if they had never tried to go to college in the first place. Now, to their credit, the for-profits have, and if you turn to now the next, and I am now up to the bar graph that says total enrollment in degree granting post-secondary institutions by race and institution type. To their credit, the for-profits have helped to make college more accessible for many students who the traditional universities had not really reached out to, and more minority students, as well as more students who are older and working and have family commitments and the like. But if you look at it, you'll see that the for-profits have a lower percentage of white students and higher minority. But it's sobering to think that these students then end up so heavily indebted and with such low graduation rates. Now, Republicans will defend this sector, saying that it's the private sector work in higher education, and that should be encouraged. What's interesting is that the for-profits are permitted by law to receive up to 90% of their revenues from one public policy, and that is the Higher Education Act Title IV. On average, they receive about 86%. And here I'm up to the next slide, which is called private sector, with a question mark on the top. So you'll see that the Apollo Group, for example, which includes the University of Phoenix and some other schools, they receive 89% of their revenues from government. This 90% rule of 90-10, they can't receive more than 90% from the Higher Ed Act, doesn't include what they can receive from other public policies, such as the GI Bill and other military education programs. So most of these large schools, which are publicly traded on Wall Street, receive a very large proportion of their funds from government. So to my mind, it's questionable whether that should be called the private sector. They're very much subsidized by government. Now, what's happened in Washington, you might ask, over time with relation to the for-profits? Ever since the for-profits became popular, which was really after the passage of the first GI Bill, right after World War II, there have been problems that have cropped up, and Congress has addressed these because they use, a great amount of federal student aid money. What's different now than in the past is that from around 1950 up through the early 1990s, and here we're looking at the next picture, or the next slide, from bipartisan efforts for reform onward. During all of those decades, eventually there would be bipartisan efforts to try to regulate the industry in some ways to both protect taxpayers and to protect students. Most recently in 1992, there was the creation of the 85-15 rule for federal student aid that the for-profits couldn't receive more than 85% of their funds from the government, and a 50% on-campus requirement that to get federal student aid funds, they had to offer at least half of their classes on campus. From the late 90s to the present, those things have been, there's been a real move toward deregulation. So the 85-15 rule was scaled back to 90-10, and the 50% requirement was done away with, and various other changes as well. The Obama administration has been making an effort to come up with what they call gainful employment rules in the Department of Ed. During Obama's first term, some of these were created. Quite a watered-down version of them was finally agreed to, but then it was thrown out by a judge. Now they're in the midst of another effort to create gainful employment rules that's going on. The photos of the people I'm showing you here are people who, during the 1980s and early 90s, were all in agreement, both someone like William Bennett, Secretary of Education under Ronald Reagan, all the way to Maxine Waters, who's a liberal Democrat in Congress, all feeling that the for-profits needed to be more effectively regulated because of the large amount of federal student aid they were using to ensure they're serving students well. And what's so surprising to me as I look at this history is how little that's happening anymore, because today Republicans have become united in support of the industry, and there are a significant number of Democrats in the House who joined with them to support it as well. And so they've been trying to send a message to the administration they don't want these gainful employment rules developed and so on. So to sum up, I think that today we need a new commitment to the broad public purposes of higher education. We tend to talk about higher education as if it's something that is just for individuals and their families to be better off. But as a society, we have broad needs to increase the percentage of highly educated people because of the impact that will have on our economy, on civic engagement and political participation, so critical to the health of democracy and to a well-functioning society. So I'd now be delighted to chat with you about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mettler. Maybe I'll start with the first question. All the future growth in the state of Texas and a population is within our minority population of Hispanics and African Americans. Their post-secondary attainment rate of the population, the 25 to 65-year-old population, is about 45% of the Anglo or white population. So I guess my question, when you look at for-profits and you look at the data that you put out, which shows they are disproportionately serving that population? Have you attempted to deaggregate and try to adjust for the higher cost or challenge of having success in terms of completion? So in other words, if they're addressing a societal problem, which is really our biggest challenge going forward, even if it costs more, have you tried to adjust for the additional cost within that population?
Right. No, that's a great question. And so I'm not someone who has done that kind of analysis. And it's certainly analysis that needs to be done. And there are some scholars who've done it, but not really conclusive studies. I mean, any institution that is trying to educate students from disadvantaged backgrounds who are the first in their family to go to college, who are low income, and so on, is going to face greater challenges in helping those students to succeed. And so, we would expect that any institution in any sector that has a high percentage of low-income students is going to face those challenges. But what disturbs me, and I don't get into that kind of analysis myself. There are other scholars who do that kind of thing. What disturbs me is the high cost for students of attending the for-profit colleges, such that nearly all of them borrow, and they borrow such large amounts. So often a student could go to a community college or a four-year public university and get the same training, the same kind of degree at a much lower cost. And then, even if they ended up dropping out, or if they do graduate, hopefully, they are not going to have anything like the kind of debt that they would have if they attend a for-profit, given the price differential.
Okay. Yes, Bernie?
Thank you, Woody. My question is, you painted the privates as de facto government contractors, I guess, because of the source of their funding. I thought that the students got the funding, and then the students made the choice to spend it with the privates. So is it the privates who have the inefficiency blood on their hands?
Right. Yeah. So, ideally in a marketplace, people have choice and they can make their choices as they wish. The for-profit colleges have done a lot of efforts at recruitment of students in a way that the public sector of universities and colleges has not done. Hasn't had the resources to do it, and perhaps it's more traditional. It doesn't operate like a business for whatever reason. Hasn't done that kind of recruitment. And what studies have shown is that most students who attend for-profit colleges, they have not considered another school. They saw some advertisement or they were recruited in some way by a for-profit, and they did not consider other options. So they don't know. I mean, they're often the first people in their family or even their community to go to college. So they don't have an understanding of what their options are. They often don't have an understanding of the level of debt that they're taking on when they sign some papers and move forward with this. So it's not, in other words, a fully informed choice. And so I think that's really problematic.
I guess the leadership should clearly communicate the value proposition to the students. I mean, if it's lack of awareness of the bad deal, we should let them know that it's a bad deal. In my opinion. One last question. I noticed that you compared Pell Grant growth to college tuition growth, I guess it is, and there's college tuition growth is growing faster. Where is that revenue going? Have you sourced where that money's going?
Right. So the question is, why has tuition gone up at the four-year public universities? The main reason why tuition has gone up is that states are scaling back what they are contributing to higher ed. That's the predominant reason. Now, higher ed costs have gone up much more quickly at public universities over time than at privates, although, of course, than private nonprofits, though, of course, private nonprofits are much more expensive. but it has gone up by a lower rate. Economists who analyze why is there an increasing cost of higher education will say that higher education, like healthcare, relies upon having human beings providing services. You can't replace very much of that effectively with technology. And so costs go up over time, particularly because you're relying upon highly educated people and more specialization over time. So those costs go up, whereas, our ability to produce cars gets cheaper over time because we have better technology to do it and we can reduce costs. So there is that differential. But the major factor, and again, I'm kind of providing for you a synthesis of a lot of existing literature on this, much of which is done by economists. The main reason why the cost of public four-year institutions has gone up over time is that states are providing less.
Yes, Robert.
My question deals with the increase in loans that you've displayed there as paying the cost of higher education. And when I look at default rates and I see that practically 1 in 4 students default on their loans in here, what political elements are involved in trying to control that element of it? Because if they're defaulting on loans in here, somebody's paying that price in here, and there seems to me that there ought to be the type of control that's necessary to keep a lid on that, and a disincentive, I guess, to the institutions.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you that this is a major problem, and this is why I actually think that it's the obligation of the federal government to regulate more effectively in this area, because you have both taxpayers left on the hook. It's the American public that pays for those loans that are defaulted on, and you're ruining the life of that individual who bought the whole idea of the American dream and really aspired to improve their life, but went to an institution where there was this very high debt and where they were not, able to get a job afterward that enables them to repay that loan. So I think that we really need to address this as a society, and it's taking a larger and larger portion. The for-profits are taking a larger and larger portion of federal student aid, and yet we're not seeing the outcomes that most Americans want to see, which is increased college graduation rates and opportunity among low to middle income people.
Yes, Steve.
Yeah, my question was really whether you had disaggregated any of your analysis, particularly in this issue when you look at state budgets contribution and how that is at best, well, if you take into account inflation probably has been substantially lower over time, but at least it's flat in your chart. Have you looked at that among the states to see those states that have done a little better on that, how they've done in some of your other outcome measures?
Yeah, I wish I could answer that question, and I'm sorry. In my own analysis, I don't delve into real distinctions between the states. I do analysis where I'm looking at all 50 states together and the determinants of which ones are spending more or spending less per capita on higher ed. But I'm not able to provide more distinctions for you, other than to say that I did find it very striking. It almost seems obvious, but when I was running my regressions from this big data set, and if you include revenues, how much states are collecting over time, those states that have boosted what they're collecting don't face this trade-off, and they've managed to continue maintaining their per capita spending on higher education while paying for these other growing costs. So that was striking to me. And I don't know your situation in Texas, but apparently since the 1970s, about half of states have made it more difficult to raise or alter their revenues by creating these kinds of policies where fiscal policy depends upon going to voters at election time in a referendum vote and that kind of thing. So I think that's part of the challenge.
Thank you. Steve, just as a point of information, we believe we can get that information from SHIO for the universities, not for the community colleges, but we can get you some access to that data.
Yes, Lionel.
Susan, do you have any information on the growth of for-profit colleges over what many years, and what is? I guess this example on DeVry is that they have about 7.7% for retained earnings. Is this indicative of the whole industry? This is one particular for-profit college, and how much I'm very familiar with the kind of marketing they do and how they recruit, how well they recruit, and how well they hide the fact that there's going to be a huge debt. I think more often what happens when they have these gigantic graduation exercises, and they've got thousands of students that come from the local arenas, and I've attended some of them, and they do all of these speeches and everything, and I would say that 90% of the students are minority students, but I happen to know several of them who were absolutely shocked at what the debt they now have. They were not at all anticipated. They're great marketers. We in the public sector are not great marketers. That's a big challenge that we have to get a marketing mindset. We started from the type of thinking, we're here, if you want to come, we can educate you. But everything has changed, and now it's much more of we've got to be as aggressive as we can in marketing. But I was wondering how big this whole segment has grown over what period of time, and what their profitability has been overall.
Yeah. So I'm very sympathetic to everything that you're saying, because it's really very much in line with the overall impression that I've been gaining as I've been studying this sector. And what I would say is that, it was back in the 1980s, you had some of the major for-profits that were then really called trade schools, proprietary schools. Some of the major ones which had been around for a long time, like DeVry, and then a lot of sort of mom and pop operations, very small operations. The industry changed in the early 1990s when they really decided we need to update ourselves and take advantage of new opportunities to use online education and to promote that. To their credit, they were thinking outside of the box. And as you say, for those of us in traditional higher education, I think it's really a very conservative sector in that we tend to do things the way we've always done them. And so, I would give the for-profits credit that they thought about how we do things differently and reach students who would otherwise not be in college. But at that point in time, 14 of them moved to become publicly traded institutions and really began to go after profits to an extent that hadn't happened previously. And with some of the larger ones, the Apollo Group and the like, they've had profit margins that are in line with those of major companies like Apple and Raytheon and so on. From the studies I've seen, most of their funds are spent, a disproportionate amount of their funds relative to traditional institutions is spent on recruitment and on their profits, but much less on instruction. And I don't have, actually in my book, I cite some previous studies that show this, and I don't have those figures at my fingertips. But traditional higher education, really puts the lion's share of funds into instruction and student support and the like, and as you say, much less into recruitment.
Yes, Steve.
Dr. Medler, there's been some discussion about marketing playing a role in students being willing to pay more to go to these institutions. Can you speak to the reality of the barriers to entry or the perceived barriers to entry? And what I mean by that is that in a marketplace you have trade-offs that people make, and there may be a perception or, again, reality that I may pay a higher dollar, but there's a higher probability that I can get a chance at an education. And perhaps when they...
Say that again, a higher probability that
there's a higher probability, or there's that I would actually be admitted and have a chance at a higher education. Because there may be a perception that if I even try to get into a four-year institution, that I can't pass the necessary tests. And so I will go to one of these institutions, pay a higher dollar amount, but at least I feel like I have a chance. So can you speak to what we can do from a higher ed standpoint to dispel some of those myths? Or
that's a great question. And I think that a lot could be done that what a group like yours, among the recommendations that you come up with, I think it could be very useful to try to provide better information to students. To prospective students, particularly those students from less advantaged backgrounds who, if we're going to increase college graduation rates, these are the students we really want to look to, but they don't have much information. So I think that's a very good idea to go in that direction. And, you may be right that students get the impression that they will, be better off in these institutions that are recruiting them heavily. And so they need additional information to help them have a fuller picture.
Ms. Lionel.
Susan, this is Lionel Sosa again. We had a presentation just last month where somebody said that community colleges and trade schools were highly undervalued, but that they do produce enough students who will get into the middle class and who will earn from $38,000 to $50,000 a year. And judging from the graduation exercises that I have attended, I would say that almost all, 90% of the students were minority, and just from the looks of things, they are this very group that Steve was just mentioning, kids who would not otherwise have the opportunity to get any education, students who were not recruited, therefore not quote-unquote wanted. If we don't recruit them, we're really saying, we don't want you. If an invitation isn't there, then why should they come? They do a good job of inviting them, and while all of these things are true, they do provide that opportunity that these students would otherwise absolutely not get. So I think that we need to look at both sides, everything that you're saying, and also look at the side that says, is this a way to get into the middle class? Do these schools really provide incomes that wind up averaging $38,000 to $50,000 a year? Or is that a myth?
Yeah. Well, I would say that community colleges are a tremendous help to people who would not otherwise go to college as sort of the front lines of higher education, and often a sector that's very tied to workplace needs. And so I completely agree with you on that score. And the great thing about attending community colleges also for students is that they're likely to have, not much debt when they leave. So with whatever jobs that they get, they're going to be more able to actually move into the middle class because they're not going to be having to make these big student loan payments that they might have otherwise. So I think that, community colleges continue to be, as they long have been, some of the most important institutions in our society for enabling that. And if a student gets an associate's degree, great. If they get the associate's degree and then go on and transfer and end up with a bachelor's from a four-year public or nonprofit university, all the better. And they will have higher lifetime earnings if they get the associate's degree compared to the high school degree, and be better off still if they're able to get the four-year degree compared to the associates. But I think that the community colleges are a great area to emphasize.
Larry?
Yes, I'd like to ask about your third slide called Inequality in College Degrees, where you show essentially the success rate is much worse in the bottom three quartiles relative to the top quartile. What would you do about it?
Yes, exactly. Well, this is the central slide. And so, what I'm saying is that we really need a kind of a multi-pronged solution. And it goes to federal student aid, it goes to state spending on public higher ed, and it goes to the for-profit colleges. And of course, I'm emphasizing the policy solutions at the higher ed level. There's many other things we could talk about, as well. But I think that we need to focus particularly on these. So in federal student aid, there are ways that we could make it more effective for low to middle income students. So I think scaling back what we're spending on these policies through the tax code, which I see as less effective, but doing more to increase Pell Grants. And then when it comes to public higher education, I think that we really need the states to reinvest in higher ed, and that's really, in some ways, the biggest story here. It's the most important story that the states were investing so much more through the middle of the 20th century and continued to increase what they were spending on average right up into the 1990s. And since then, it's really tapered off. So that's the second big story. And then the third story is the for-profits. Well, on the one hand, they only enroll 1 in 10 college students. The reason why I'm paying so much attention to them is that they are the sector that's particularly attracting low-income students and students that it could make a big difference if these people could successfully get college degrees, but in fact, they're not serving them so well. So that's where I think we need more management and regulation of the sector to help enable them to do that. And, I know that you're going to be hearing from DeVry, and I think that DeVry is an institution that's been around for a long time and really has a great history in the past. When I did my project on World War II veterans, I interviewed veterans who'd gone to DeVry and really benefited from it. So the question is, how can we work with an institution like DeVry to try to ensure that they're really serving the public interest, which I believe they have in the past.
But I heard you say that the largest part of this is a matter of money, and you believe that's true?
The largest part is a matter of money?
The largest parts of this issue, this inequality in college degrees, is financing.
It's financing. Well, it's financing, but it's not just financing. I think that we're spending, at the federal level today, we have 1 in 4 federal student aid dollars going to a sector that has really poor outcomes. And we're also spending a lot through the tax code in a way that doesn't expand graduation rates effectively. So I think we're not, in part, we're not spending money wisely. When it comes to the state level, I think we need more spending. And it's more of a simple story there, I would say.
Thank you.
Bernie?
I wanted to follow up on Lionel's question, and that I just think it's the poor pay more. I think it's predatory with the private. They target minority students. They run into relatively weak resistance to bull. Those kids aren't equipped to make an informed decision. I think the way we should handle that is to educate them on the value proposition. I really think that's the solution. In my extended family, when I see a young kid nibbling on those infomercial schools, I hit them in the head with a frying pan. So I just wanted to support what you were saying in that regard.
Yeah, I think that, a lot of headway could be made in that direction. It's a little tricky. I mean, in part, you can do it through high schools and giving students more information at that level. And I think we could do a lot more to have more guidance counselors in public high schools and more information for students. But then there are some students, prospective students of the for-profits, that will be harder to reach because they're older students. And when they enroll, they're long out of high school. And so then it's a little bit trickier to figure out how you reach them. And there you might have to do something that's more on the community level.
Lori, I think this will probably be our last question. Yes.
Okay, going back to the slide of the inequality in college degrees, and Dr. Faulkner's question, I would submit that in the last 10 years anyway, that our move toward more of a hybrid in college access of the urban districts, for example, have a majority minority student and a majority free and reduced lunch student. And those are the very students that are now going through the early college program, the dual credit program. When we talk about the $10,000 degree, if it's ever going to happen, it's going to be through that avenue. Most of the major universities and certainly all of the community colleges that I know of are offering the dual credit and the early college. So if we ever want to get the bottom and the second quartile out of the rut of, as a percentage of not going to college or not attaining a 4-year college degree, I would submit that the way to do that is more of the hybrid that we're seeing now, with more and more students going through and getting at least 2, 3, 4, 5 different college programs under their belt, classes under their belt, and getting, upwards of an associate's degree by the time they graduate from high school.
Yeah. Well, that sounds wise to me. I can't comment on that in particular, but that, that certainly sounds like an appropriate way to go, and to think of that kind of tailoring, given the particular needs in Texas and what you're already doing. It sounds like a wise approach. I did want to make one more unrelated comment before I sign off with you, and that is about online education. We haven't talked about online education. The for-profits were really first movers in this and embracing the possibilities of technology. And it's one of the things that have made them attractive to people who are older and already have a lot of responsibilities for work and taking care of children and so on, because they can take classes at home. But the problem is that, and since then, actually, public universities and colleges have been moving toward a lot of online education as well as a way to save money. The problem is that our enthusiasm for online education, I would say, is out ahead of our understanding of how to use it well to really educate people, particularly people who come from a less advantaged background. So, when you look at like online programs like the MOOCs, the massive online learning courses and so on, lots of people sign up for them, but very few people actually complete them. And the people who do complete them are people who have a lot of education already. So these are highly educated people. They have college degrees. They often have more advanced degrees beyond college. And they, along the way, have learned how to learn independently, and they're able to do that. But for a student who is approaching college, who doesn't have necessarily the best skills for success there, I think we need to be cautious about using too much online learning. I think at least a combination of bricks and mortar with online, and preferably with more of the former than the latter, would be really useful for really helping the students to succeed.
Dr. Medler, thank you very much for your time today. It's been very helpful to our committee's work.
Well, thank you. I hope so. I've enjoyed being with you, and I'm sorry that my PowerPoint didn't work out. But
everything worked fine. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Woody, may I interject? We've lumped all of these nonprofit organizations together to come up with a percent of default rates and finances and so on. Is there any kind of state report that differentiates between the distance education institutions and the career and the cosmetology schools and all of the other nonprofit or for-profit institutions?
I'm sorry I didn't hear the beginning of your question, but let me just add one thing. Dakota asked earlier what the state's doing with for-profits, and the state opened the doors a bit in about 7 or 8 years ago, but with certain requirements that in terms of accreditation. We get student complaints. We haven't had to do it recently, but we've actually visited campuses following up on complaints. The commissioner has recently mentioned, given some of the issues with Corinthian, that we need to find a way to be a little bit more active in reviewing the schools. It's a broad sector, so that there's lots of variation in terms of what the schools do. But I think most importantly, when we opened the door, we required that institutions operating in Texas provide us with student record data, the same data we receive from Rice, SMU, Baylor, Trinity. And so what that means is, just as we're able to follow students in their success from public to public in Texas and to public to privates, we're also able to do it with the DeVrys and the Phoenixes and the ITTs in the state. So, and also look at whether they're graduating, look at certain basic characteristics of the students. We don't have the full range of data, but we may be one of the few states that has that capacity. But when the doors was open, that was required. We insisted on that piece, and the sector welcomed it, but we haven't had that data for that long now, so we still have a lot of work to do with that. And yes, sir.
Well, I want to whisper that in David's ear. Having come here to the state in 1972 and seen what the coordinating board has done over the years, literally over the decades, to control external forces coming into the state and trying to maintain the level of higher education. The coordinating board deserves a big round of applause for what they've done. And I don't know that all of you understand that or have seen it, but as a guy who's been in the public and the private side of education in the state of Texas, you're to be commended. Thank you.
Thank you. And there's a whole different set of institutions as well that try to come.
Oh, yes. I've seen them all.
Help with local district attorneys and the state attorney general's office. And in fact, one of them I discovered was renter with my father-in-law that later was run out of business. But they're a very different kind of institution than DeVry.
David, the question I really have is that, clearly one of the factors I think that addresses a kind of issue that Lionel was talking about in terms of interest, I agree fully that part of the problem is kids don't know what their options are, don't know what's possible. On the other hand, and maybe Larry can answer this, but I'm not sure how many of our public college presidents would want to be defending a large element in their budget for advertising. In fact, I can imagine thinking of the people in our legislature, there would be some questions about why in the world are you doing that? And so I wondered has the coordinating board ever done any studies looking at the issues that relate to who goes where and what the factors are in students' choices of whether they go to a traditional college or go to a for-profit?
No, we have not, and it would make some sense for us to do that. We haven't done that, or get some of our colleagues at institutions to design some studies, in fact, do that. That would be very helpful. Related to that, Shirley was also whispered to me, and the state created Go Centers along with our Closing the Gaps plan, and supported them for a number of years. One thing, we haven't provided any state support to those for a number of years, but what's striking is we've about doubled the number of Go Centers since we actually quit providing support. And that doesn't suggest we don't provide support, but it means that it was something that was helpful and people were willing to put money into it. Along with that, some of you have heard about Advise Texas, where we've put advisors into, and actually Mr. Hunt has helped fund some of those advisors into low-performing schools, and we've seen a lot of success with that we are asking for $8 million of legislative support to expand that. But that places what's called a near-peer advisor into the school, someone who's recently graduated from, in our case, either Texas A&M, UT Austin, TCU, Trinity, Texas State, and they work in the schools for about 2 years, and they've found great success. So part of it is getting information to them, but also doing the type of study you're talking about, Stephen. So we ought to talk about how that might be designed and who might be a good player for that. I have to say, I could almost be convinced by some of the DeVry commercials to go back to school. And I do think it would be hard to justify from an advertising standpoint. We might want to think, is there something the state could do overall, not just an institution, through things like outreach to the schools, in terms of talking about all the sectors and the various schools available to them. Many students don't even sometimes realize the access they have to higher education institutions in their own town, which is unfortunate.
Right. And the coordinating board had their trying to create this college-going culture program. Remember, and I forget the name of the advertising firm, but that was really spending.
In Texas.
The Generation Texas, trying to create a college-going culture. Coordinating board coordinating and raising the dollars. Public, but largely public, maybe some private, to do that. That really was, and it was more on a trial basis, as I remember, in a couple of areas. I don't know where we are and what the status is today.
The campaign is still active. We need to put, I think, some additional effort into it. But much of this is based upon local, really informing people in the local area so that they're better informed in terms of helping their own students, their own children, no more, periodically with campaigns like that, you have to ramp them up a bit. Maybe Mr. Sosa has some ideas. He's been helpful over the years.
He's good.
I was guessing you would say that.
We're going to get off Larry, and then we'll try to get on to our next speaker.
Well, I think there is a place for advertising in this, but I actually sympathize with what Steve said about not wanting to defend, as an institutional leader, spending a lot of money on advertising. I'd like to comment on the question that I asked Suzanne, which is about that slide 3. I think that's an absolutely critical diagnostic slide that's not just about Texas, it's about the whole nation, but it's absolutely what we're after. And we really have to find ways to attack that. And I asked her keenly whether she thought it was money. She obviously did think it was mostly money. I'm not so sure. I personally doubt that it's mostly money. It, I think, has to do with embedded attitudes. When you've got kids coming out of the upper quartile, you've got them mostly coming out of families that have college education. And they start to build those expectations at an early age that that's what they're going to do, and they follow up, and they're educated about what steps have to be taken. And the further you go down the income quartiles, the less that's true. I believe that we really need to get we do need to work on attitudes, but we've been working too late, in my judgment. I think that the place we have to start is in middle school, and we have to both enlist. We have to enlist the kids. We have to start getting them interested in something, but we also, in parallel, have to get their parents interested in something. And I really think that's. I mean, if I were the czar, I would invest in that. And then I'm also with Laurie that I think giving them some kind of a taste of college success, a college experience while they're in high school is another way.
Let me say just one thing. I would agree with that, and I think there's another aspect of that, and that is we also need to do something about the negative advertising that goes on with kids. Many kids with limited resources start hearing immediately, well, you're never going to go to college. Nobody in this family's ever gone to college, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that we need to, whether it's through the educational system or something, we need to be helping that kid see that, no,
I think
you have a chance.
You're absolutely right, Steve.
Laurie, and then we've got to move on.
Right. Well, if you want to see a success percentage-wise, you look no further than some of the successful charter schools where the whole attitude and philosophy is you will go to college. What they found, of course, is that they can get any kid into college. It's keeping them there and making sure they're college ready. But I was also going to comment on the college-bound culture of the coordinating board's overarching philosophy several years ago. It has had a lasting, sustainable effect on many of the ISDs throughout Texas. In fact, I'll cite Spring Branch ISD. Their number one and only goal of the entire district is that they will double the amount of high school graduates that attain a certification or four-year degree, period. And that all came from creating a college-bound culture, became a part of their policy early on, as did for, Shirley, you can say probably for most of the school districts. So it did have I hate to say spillover effect because that's minimizing what it really was. It really had a lasting effect on the attitude of, poor, minority, middle class, whatever, you will go to college. And that's the goal.
Okay, I think this discussion has well set up our next speaker. So I'd like to introduce Thomas Babel, who is the Vice President for Regulatory Affairs for DeFry Education Group. As the Regulatory Compliance Officer for DeFry, Thomas is responsible for assuring that DeFry institutions operate in compliance with all federal, state, and provincial regulations governing school operations, student financial assistance programs. He joined DeFry in 1984, held a number of positions, served on a number of advisory councils for federal and state governmental agencies, lending institutions, and technology companies as well. He's worked extensively with the U.S. Department of Education on a number of program and modernization initiatives, including chairing a national initiative to re-engineer the student aid delivery process. With that, I would like to welcome Thomas Babel.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to come here, and hopefully I can offer something that's helps contribute to your conversation and strategic planning going forward. I'm going to contain most of my remarks to DeVry. I don't really know a whole lot about the sector. I'll offer what I do know about the sector as a whole, but I think I can kind of share enough information about DeVry, and maybe that's a model for how you either want to view a sector or view institutional performance or accountability going forward. But before I get into kind of what my planned comments were, I want to kind of address the advertising marketing questions that have been going around, because we've done some research in this area and studies, and maybe I hadn't planned on commenting on this directly, but maybe what we know will help inform you too, and certainly reinforce Mr. Francis and Mr. Sosa's observations. One is that the first is we spend, I don't want to say disproportionately, but when you look at what our spend rate is for advertising and marketing, it stands out as more than what you would see in traditional institutions. And that's because we're spending to create media impressions that traditional institutions get for free. So whether it's athletic events or it's patents or research studies or putting experts in the press, they're getting a lot more impressions for free than what our programming would essentially get. With a few exceptions, we don't have athletic teams and we don't have research on our institutions. Although DeVry has some experts and do get in the media in providing experts specifically related to career education, you don't see a lot of that either. And so most of our media impressions that DeVry or any of the private sector institutions have to attain are done through paid media. To that extent, though, if you look at the free impressions that traditional institutions do obtain, they are appealing more to that upper quartile in the income. Whether it's the athletic team or specifically in the research studies patent attainment or just that kind of policy statements, it's the upper quartile that are going to be more attracted to institutions that can put forward that type of media impression. And by that media impression, they're saying, come to us. We're the institution for you. And they're ignoring the bottom three quartiles. Our media impressions, conversely, say to more specifically, probably the bottom two quartiles, say, yes, college is available to you. Yes, you can be successful. Yes, come. Here's an opportunity for you. And so at the risk of shooting ourselves in the foot, absolutely, that's what this organization and other state organizations should be focused on. How do we get, and especially, I noticed on the board out there that one of your great opportunities is you only have 68% of your eighth graders making it to college or high school graduation. So when you look at attainment, that's 32. That's almost a third of the population you're leaving off. And a lot of them, I'm going to guess, are dropping out because in eighth grade, they don't ever perceive that college is attainable for them. They don't look at that as an opportunity for them. And so if they're not taking a rigorous high school program, they're not putting the time into the studies, they don't see the return, they're beginning to look for work opportunities and moving away from that. And so the more that we can get an eighth grader and the family, especially of eighth graders, to realize college is attainable for them, I think that's where we close the gap. And so I'll just kind of leave it there, and we certainly come back to that. But let me kind of do two things with my comments. One, I want to talk a little bit about DeVry. I'm pretty certain you're all familiar with DeVry University. You may not be so aware of our other educational institutions. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And then I want to talk about our accountability framework that we've put forward and how that fits into maybe your agenda, but certainly I think what we think is needed in higher education overall. So first of all, DeVry Education Group consists of 6 higher education institutions serving the U.S. market, if you will. DeVry University, which I spoke of, has been around since 1931, so serving students around the country, primarily in fields of business and technology. But our oldest institution is Chamberlain College of Nursing. It's been around since 1889. It's a nursing college focused here. We've got 2 campuses in Texas, and we'll be opening a third, all in the Houston area. The third one will open later this winter. We also have a junior college level 2-year institution called Carrington College. It has a campus in Mesquite, but mostly their campuses are located out west. And then we have 3 professional schools: Ross University School of Veterinary Medicine, Ross University School of Medicine, and American University of the Caribbean. The last 2 are medical schools. So combined, we've got over 100 campuses around the country and serving today almost about 90,000 students across the U.S. In addition to those 6 institutions, we have a professional education program that was rooted in the Becker CPA courses, and since then we've expanded its offerings, but that's our Becker Professional Review Division. And then we also have a number of institutions down in Brazil, serving I think about 13 campuses now and getting close to 30,000 students. And so that's an area that is growing for DeVry as an organization, and as well as the Brazilian higher education market. all of our U.S. institutions are governed. So DeVry Education Group has a board of directors, and that board of directors is accountable to the shareholders to ensure that we're profitable and that we are financially stable and producing a good educational quality product overall. And so they have that broad oversight. But each of our institutions has a separate board of trustees, and that board of trustees has delegated powers from the board of directors, and almost absolute in the sense that they're responsible for the academic quality of the programs. They are not responsible to ensure that the institution makes any money, and so it essentially removes the profit-making motive out of the higher level decision making that has to go on within the organization. So they have to assure that the academic programs are of a quality nature, that they're meeting their stated objectives. They are responsible for the mission of the organization. They hire and fire the president, hold them accountable, and then review the budgets each year to assure that there's appropriate resources to deliver not only the programs but also the services around that program. And so if you read Suzanne Mettler's book, there's a concern there that shareholders could have an undue influence on the outcomes of the institution. They could probably inappropriately drive a profit-making motive at the risk or at the cost of academic quality. The Board of Trustees actually insulates against that, and so that's their job, and potentially there could be a rift between the Board of Trustees and the Board of Directors, but that hasn't happened today in our world. With regard to Texas, as I mentioned, we've got our three undergraduate serving institutions, all have campuses here, Carrington, Chamberlain, and DeVry University. We've got about 6,300 students enrolled in those institutions, as well as 400 Texas residents who are enrolled in the three professional schools. A little bit of information about those students. 80% of them in the undergraduate serving institutions, so Carrington, Chamberlain, and DeVry University. Chamberlain and DeVry University both have graduate divisions, Chamberlain going up to the doctor in nursing practice, and DeVry University going up to various master's degrees. But 80% of them are 25 years or older, so a much older market. 62% are part-time. And going back to Suzanne's comments about outcomes, when we look at graduation rates, she cited a 22% graduation rate. That's first-time full-time students that enroll first-time full-time. So 62% of our students are part-time. They would never be included in that measure. Additionally, anybody who has been at another institution wouldn't be counted in that measure. So Chamberlain College of Nursing, over 80% of our enrollments are transfer students, and at DeVry University, over 60% of our enrollment, or almost 60% of our enrollments are transfer students. So if you look at our undergraduate population in whole, last year, less than 5% of our students were first-time, full-time students. So when you look at a graduation rate, it's really not measuring actual outcomes at the institution. Additionally, as she noted, we do serve a high percentage of minority students. About 52% of our students here in Texas self-report or self-categorize themselves as a minority student. Last year, we conferred 1,600 certificate and degrees, 12% at the undergraduate certificate and associate degree level, 48% at the bachelor's degree, and then the rest at the graduate certificate or master's degree level. We don't do a lot of certificates, but there are some of those in the mix in both the undergrad and grad level. Just kind of give you some comparison to some of Suzanne's numbers. Our actual if you look at students who start full-time and complete versus first-time full-time, our completion rate is right around 50% when you aggregate it for the three institutions. Our borrowing rate, that 94% of students borrow that she reported on a national level, ours is about 90%, so something fairly comparable. And then if you look at our aggregated default rate across all of our institutions, it's going to be in the low to mid-teens, and it varies significantly by the type of institution, running from 0.2% at Ross University School of Veterinary Medicine to roughly about 23% at Carrington College. And that is more reflective of the type of studies as well as the demographics of the students. But one note about that default rate, and I think Mr. Massey or Mr. Ferguson, one of the two of you had a question about cost. That is a cohort default rate. And so being real sensitive to the human factor, the human cost of defaulting that Suzanne referenced, default is always a bad situation. It stains your credits, harms your ability to get future financing or participate in other transactions. So it certainly is not anything that anybody wants or would like to see. That doesn't reflect the actual cost of defaults, though. The federal government actually will recover 96% over in their budget. They estimate over 96% of all the loans that they issue out. And then when you look at the fees that are in there as well as interest that they accrue or they receive on those student loans, the federal government has actually made a profit on the student loan business over the last 3 to 4 years. And so it is not a costly venture for them at all. And so it's a little more perspective. So one of the things I referred to here is that, and kind of go to Suzanne's comments a little bit about poor outcomes in the sector, is that we don't really know what the outcomes are from the sector. The completion rate is really not transparent at all in terms of what our students are doing and how they're performing against other schools. Default rate, kind of, as I said, misrepresents the actual true cost, which I think is an important assessment. We don't know about employment widely across the sector or any institution. And so trying to address that, DeVry has come up with an accountability framework that hopefully begins to put some measures in place that actually measures performance. And the first thing we do is start irregardless of the institution. We are all dependent on taxpayer funding. And so regardless of your sector, there are very few schools without taxpayer funding that could continue to exist. Certainly none that could continue to exist as they do today. And so whether it's 90%, 80%, 70%, that generally most schools are falling in that range in reliance on taxpayer funding. And there should be some accountability for your outcomes in that. And what we've done is identify 4 areas for measures of outcomes. One is do students learn? And so look at how do we measure student learning. It's probably the most difficult area to measure student learning, but there are vehicles for doing so. Things like standardized tests, which a lot of rankles a lot of perspectives, but they are there. They measure things like the CLA or major field tests or even licensing exams, which are probably more appropriate for those type of career-oriented programs, and so those are direct measures. But even a simple measure such as course success rates. So our students being successful in courses, most faculty will go far from go a long way in rejecting influences of the institution to pass students and inflate that. But we think course success rates, just looking at our own organization, is a good measure of productivity or unproductivity, and so that would be a simple measure. Completion rate is another measure that we think is important, but it has to measure all students. It can't measure just that subset. And for DeVry's, from DeVry's basis. You can't hold a school accountable for what 5% of your students do. You want to look at all students. But when you look at all students and you look at the quality of an institution, we're going to suggest you need to measure or include in that determination the risk attributes of the students. Clearly, a student who is a single parent living partially on public assistance and balancing work, family, and school demands is not going to have the same success rate at completing their program as the 19-year-old coming out going full-time with strong family support and a 31 ACT. That's just there's just fundamental differences in that population, and that has to be accounted for in the overall rate. One of the things that we really struggle with is understanding part-time students. Part-time students, regardless of the institution, the sector, don't complete at a high rate anywhere. And so measuring their performance is, on a completion rate, we're struggling with that. Is that really a viable measure for part-time students? And this is where we get to the course success rate, academic progress rate. We see part-time students come and go. We know that their educational attainment horizon is a lot longer. If you tell them that we're going to measure you whether you complete in 4 years, they'd probably say, why the heck would you do that? I don't intend to complete in 4 years, so I'm not sure why you'd measure that. And so that's a complication in there. The third area that we think is important to measure and hold schools accountable is in their success rates after they complete their studies. So are they getting a job? Are they getting into graduate school? Are they continuing their studies? And so a measure in that area. And then the fourth area that we think is important is actually the loan repayment rate. And so not so much the cohort default rate, which I think is an important consumer protection, but when you're looking at the quality of the institution, we would think that measuring actually the repayment of principal is a better reflection. And that's simply because graduates are going to incur more debt, and their ability to get jobs, understanding what their financial obligations are and repay that loan, I think you want to weight that principle because I think it's more reflecting of the value of the program and not an individual student decision. So we would propose those measures in those other areas. One other measure that we've talked about in various initiatives that we participated in, we worked with the Gates Foundation, we worked with Nexus, we've done some work with the Association of Institutional Researchers in participating in projects and providing data that helps better understand what metrics are more appropriate and more revealing of program quality. And one of the ones that we've wrestled with is on this area of cost. And certainly when we talk about costs from a student perspective, that absolutely is information that a consumer should have. They should know what their costs are going to be. But in terms of assessing institutional performance, it's missing something, right? We know that students' cost in coming to our institutions is certainly going to be larger than what a public institution is because our students don't generally have any state subsidies in going to our programs. And so it's important for us to look, we think it's important if you're assessing the quality of a program or quality of an institution that you actually look at a total cost. And so what is it that the institution is receiving in the way of funding on their for students? And so for example is that we know that across the nation by sector that the amount of revenue that private sector or for-profit schools receive on a FTE basis, a full-time equivalent basis, is about 2/3 that of a public four-year student, and it's less than half that of a private not-for-profit student. And so we're more efficient in serving that students. I think now we want to translate that to outcomes and look at that in the way of are we being more efficient in terms of our productivity? But that's just kind of an area that I think. Well, I know that a number of initiatives that we've worked in are struggling with how do you effectively measure cost in terms of produced production on the back end and stuff. Then our framework actually is built on two pillars. The one is on measures, and the other is on practices. And so one of the practices that we have in place today that hopefully is effective is that we believe that no student should ever start school without knowing what their costs will be, how they're going to finance their education, and what the implications of that financing is. And so every student that comes through, it's possible they reject it, but every student is scheduled for a financial advising session. And in most cases, our undergraduate students cannot clear to start school until they've completed that financial advising session, and they're walked through that process and how they're going to pay for their education. Financing today is not a simple process. It's overwhelming, and it's likely that some of our students walk away from that experience not fully understanding what's there. And so we built some tools to sit on top of that. And so one of the things that we had the pleasure of showing staff here yesterday was a new portal we built for our students called Manage My Loans, and allows students to see on a real-time basis the amount of debt that they've incurred, not just at DeVry, but all the debt that they've incurred at institutions they might have attended elsewhere, and what the implications of that debt is, so they can see what the borrowing is. They can see what the monthly payment obligations would be, and they will know whether or not it's going to put them in a financial stressful position when they enter graduation. They can see what their rate of borrowing is against their rate of their academic progress. And so hopefully that's educating our students more. We've just launched this in June, and we've gotten some very positive feedback from our students on it. We also believe that there should be a sufficiency of professionally trained staff available for students, not just in financing, but in academic advising, as well as in the enrollment process, so the recruiting process, and that all of our advisors should come through, all students should come through an advisor who has had some training provided to them that's been developed or certified from somebody independent from our institution. So, standardizing what would be an ethical practice among recruiters that helps assure that we don't have some of the abuses that have been reported on in the past. We also think that students who enroll in open or near open, and especially some that have are more expensive, but near or open or near open, have some sort of financial safety net, so that they can at least try, go to school, understand what that experience is, and at least at an early point, be able to walk away without a big cost hanging over their heads. We want to encourage and hopefully incentivize students to go to college and to move up. And so those are just some of the practices that we think are important for all institutions to provide security to students, if you will. Again, this is a framework that we think helps kind of get us out of the argument that we've been engaged in here, whether a sector is good or bad, and moves us to a more neutral position of is this institution actually serving students? Is it serving taxpayers? Is it producing quality graduates for employers in our workforce and position? So thanks, and I'm glad to answer any questions.
Okay, I'd like to open it for questions. Yes, Bernie?
I was wondering, your mix of students, low income versus others.
Yeah, so it varies a little bit by institution, but in aggregate, our undergraduate institutions, about 50% are Pell receiving. DeVry University and Carrington College, it's going to be over 60%. Chamberlain College of Nursing, because there's a large population that are already nurses, RNs that are coming back for their bachelor's degree or going on for graduate level courses, that's going to be a higher income.
Overall, 50%?
Overall, 50% at the undergraduate level.
Okay. And if they show up with enough money, they get in, right? I mean, there's no...
No.
Okay,
none of our institutions are open enrollment. There's admission standards for each of them.
How do you manage that? How describe it to me.
So there are a number of options. So let me just use DeVry University, which is probably the more complicated. Chamberlain College of Nursing has an entrance exam. It's competitive to get in, at least at the freshman level. And Carrington College is more the 2-year type program. There is an entrance exam. It's a standardized entrance exam. But in DeVry University, we either take ACT or SAT scores. We'll take prior college experience. We'll look at high school curriculum and accept you if you've gotten B or better, taking 3 or 4 math courses at college level. Or we have an entrance exam, a college board placement exam that we'll take and score you on.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Yes, Jerry.
Okay. My question would be, let's say, for example, that I'm talking more for the for-profit sector, but let's say somebody started at your institution or a for-profit institution. What's the coordination between that college and the public universities and community colleges, for example, in terms of transfer of credits? I mean, is that a real issue, a real problem?
So if they started at a community college and then came to DeVry to get their bachelor's degree,
vice versa,
or vice versa. I wish there was more coordination. There isn't a lot of coordination, design pathways between the two sectors, the two colleges. We are regionally accredited. All of our institutions are regionally accredited, so you don't have that bar on transferring credit to traditional colleges. We have a very rapid transcript evaluation process, so we can tell students generally within 48 hours how much transfer credit they're going to get, and certainly they should know that information before they start.
And one more follow-up,
Yes, sure.
if I could. For your medical students, for example, do you have problems with the State Board of Medical Examiners getting those students' licenses in the state of Texas, A, and B, would you have issues in actually getting residencies for these individuals in the U.S.?
We don't. So our residency match rate, first-time residency match rate, so there's a match process that almost all residency slots in the U.S. are participate in, and so you have a single day at the end of March in which every medical student gets their residency assignment. We've got roughly about an 85%, up or down a little bit each year on that first-time match rate at our 2 medical schools, and then that'll increase over time as they go through, and there's a secondary match process, and then there's out of match processes, so that ultimately gets up to about 94%. So residency, no, and licensure. The complication there would be is if a student took an elective that was not in an accredited environment, and so that we try to control for that. But students sometimes can do that on their own, and so that can be problematic for them. Yes, sir.
Ms. Baum.
I think this is more of a comment that builds on one of the points that you made in there, and that's relative to the full-time, first-time student measurement in there, that when I went to Corpus Christi State University back in 1990, that it was upper-level university, and guess what? No first-time, full-times, that everybody had to transfer in. Well, we made the transition into adding the freshman classes and so on, and yet when you looked back again in 1990, that the typical student that we had was 33 years old, single woman that had dependents, and was part-time. We did not want to abandon those students. We wanted to make sure that they felt as welcome as we were trying to welcome in new freshmen. So I sympathize with you on this measurement of full-time, first-time students in here because it depends upon what that institution is trying to do relative to its mission. And I would, to me, that full-time, first-time stuff in here is, yeah, that's okay, but what's the mission of the institution and how does the measurement reflect that mission?
May I add something? We've been having that discussion a long time, and we clearly think it's possible. I just happened to pull up that we do have part-time graduation rates for the publics, and it's 34.9% for the last cohort that we measured over 6 years. One advantage, and actually it turns out Julie and Susan and I all made the same note, we have the capability now to begin to at least look at Texas students that have moved on to DeVry and Phoenix and others and see what that process is really like. And I know that the commissioners made the point, whatever the preparation of the student, that if you admit them, there's some institutional, and you certainly had this at Corpus, and responsibility to provide what resources they need to help them graduate. If there's someone who comes in and thinks, I'm going to graduate in 20 years, but I personally would encourage them to graduate sooner because they're not going to reap the full benefits of that education. And I don't know how people manage to graduate over 20 years. I think you have to be really persistent to do that. We know from our data that most students, if they haven't graduated in 5 years, are not likely to. But you will find them, and we've tracked for as long as 15 years to discover that. So I just want to make that point, and I know that you were committed to those students. But we keep breaking down this data in far, very different ways. And so I think, again, it's just important to realize, despite whatever they bring to the table, I think we have some responsibility to do everything we can to help them graduate in a timely fashion. I know Dr. Faulkner's been wanting to say something.
Yes, Larry, go ahead.
Yeah, it's occurred to me, and I'm wondering, since we have the experts opposite, that would it be more productive for us to measure the ratio of people who leave the institution with a credential divided by those who stopped paying the institution in the last year?
That's something we've never thought of.
I mean, if you think about it that way, you can take care of all the part-time, full-time, everything.
Well, look at
the question is, what fraction leaving actually took away a credential?
Well, we have
Can you
looked
do
at
that, Susan?
We can do that.
Yeah.
I'm writing that one down. I like new questions.
We've only looked at this 50 or 60 different ways, and you're the first person who's raised that, so thank you for that.
Yes, Laurie.
I seem to recall that veterans, Army, Navy veterans, are not able to access veteran benefits to go to proprietary universities. Am I wrong on that?
Yeah, no, that's just the opposite.
Really?
We have a disproportionate percentage of veterans enrolled in private sector schools.
And so they can't access all of the benefits of attending college and paying for college?
As long as if you're Title IV eligible as an institution, then you're also eligible to participate in both you're broadly eligible to participate in the VA and the DoD tuition assistance programs. There's some sanctions that could exclude you. Further, if you're accredited but not participating, you should be eligible.
Maybe it was just the Art Institute that I'm recalling that they weren't able to do that. Am I right on that?
I believe that was one of the institutions that had such a high default rate.
Okay.
Got into some kind of problems. I'm getting a nod.
I remember
yes,
that.
There, but that's
okay, my second question is, can you speak to the fixed tuition promise that you all talk about at DeVry?
Sure. And it's not unlike a number of other institutions or state in Illinois. Our state institutions actually do the same. What we've done is just promise students that we're not going to increase their tuition once they start. You're going to pay at the same rate, the same structure that or less. We could decrease it, but.
And that's if they complete in a certain amount of time, or if they keep going and going and going. Once they start, it's fixed?
Right now, it's, yeah. we actually wrestled with that. We made it simple and just said, let's not overcomplicate it. And so, yeah.
Wow.
Tom, what is your percentage of minority students, your percentage of low-income students, and your percentage male versus female?
So it's I don't know the latter across. I'll tell you, of course, Chamberlain College of Nursing is over 80% female. DeVry University used to be mostly male. It's gotten to be pretty much a lot more even, closer to 50%. And Carrington College, which primarily offers programs in allied health like dental assisting, dental hygiene, medical assisting, is largely female too. But as far as low income, as I said before, about 50% of our undergraduate students are Pell eligible, so that'll do that. And then 52% of our students have self-categorized themselves as a minority population.
And do you have any percentages of how many are actually placed in the profession that they had chosen? Because let's say that they all graduate with C's and they're not, but they all get jobs that that put them into the middle class.
Yeah. So for DeVry University, generally our benchmark has been 90%, and so we run a little above, a little below that sometimes.
90% placement?
So let me clarify that. So 90% of our graduates who are actively seeking employment or were already employed in their field of study at the time of graduate are employed in their field of study. I kind of said that in a long-winded way, but that includes students who may have been employed in a field but didn't have a credential, chose to come to DeVry, get that credential, presumably to secure their employment or for promotion opportunities, as well as those who attain a position. A lot of our students come to us, they get some studies, they begin working part-time in the field, and then go on full-time once they complete, as well as those who get the job after they complete. So.
Okay, I mean, getting back to some of the earlier comments, particularly from Dr. Faulkner on the chart, which is, I think we can all agree, is kind of central to the purpose of this committee. It's what in our discussion we've had today, which our first speaker pointed out, the inequality of college degrees. But I think the question is, and which is what I think Larry was raising, is what do we do about it? And is it policy or is it money? And I've always tried to use the words trying to incentivize the pipeline, both individually and institutionally. In other words, what kind of incentives from a policy and or a money standpoint can we use to try to deal with this issue? And one thing, David, is from a data that I think might be interesting is because we look at graduation rates in quartiles. We know, and we do have the data on the ethnicity, that we know that the bottom quartiles are heavily disproportionately Hispanic and African American in this state. I don't know whether we really know, by quartile we presume that I think we're presuming here that our student population is evenly distributed across quartiles. So that when we're looking at 71% in the top quartile that are graduating, that essentially represents 25% of our students. But my suspicion is that the lower quartiles have a disproportionately, not only are they disproportionately African American and Hispanic, particularly Hispanic, but they're also disproportionately have a higher per capita of students in that family that happens to be in that income quartile. So I think we ought to do, and I don't know whether Steve has a comment on that, but well, I mean, we're looking at quartiles that are based on U.S. population with family income. So if the family size in the top quartile is 2.2 children, and in the bottom quartile it's 2.8 children, we actually have a larger concentration of those that are economically disadvantaged in the lower quartile. I think you're right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I'd like to convert that from an intuitive into a statistical conclusion.
Yeah. So a little differently, of course, this is data that she got from Mortensen, who's in Illinois or Indiana, from the feds. But we were talking before the meeting about the increased granularity in terms of the 8th grade cohort that we did recently for the Houston Endowment. And there we get more into the economically disadvantaged versus other groups. And we already know that if you look at the likelihood to graduate just based on a simple percent, that African Americans and Hispanics are less likely, but it's the percent is even lower if you're economically disadvantaged.
Well, if you're
regardless of your race and ethnicity.
If you live in Houston, if you're economically disadvantaged and you're either an Hispanic or an African American male, you've got a 5% chance within 6 years of high school graduation of having some type of higher education attainment, which will mostly be in an associate degree.
Right. So I think we will have more data to share with you on that. And I think related to Dr. Faulkner's remark earlier, it ties directly into when do you begin talking to the students, which would suggest middle school. We've thought that for a number of years, but we haven't really succeeded in doing that yet. And so I think the data supports doing that. And I just wanted to sort of underline a little bit what you're just saying. Today, you're really going to begin to start talking about what are perhaps some key strategies to help achieve the goal. And so you've begun to touch on, is there an area here, or even it could be, do we need to do something more explicitly or strongly in terms of the middle schools? And so you'll begin those discussions today. But we can follow up on that and get maybe again, Steve, and we can talk more about your specific question to see if we can address it.
Yes, Tom.
Yeah, so if I could share a little bit of our experience in that area. Well, one is I think it's important that we get people in believing that college is attainable for them, and so they go. And so that's not even half the battle. So once you get them in the door, what do you have to do? And what we've learned is that's a very heavy lift. They can get there, they can be fully qualified to get there, but they've got other things going on. One is generally they have a lack of confidence in their ability to be successful. And so the first academic bump in the road, they'll withdraw. They have other things going in their life. They generally are not going away to college and in that protective cocoon. They're a commuter student that have other draws. A lot of them are friends who aren't in college and want to do other things with them too. So it takes an intrusive level of engagement with those students. One, to reinforce their ability, to coach them, to help them plan their weeks, plan their studies, to identify what may be a negative influence on there. And so we've done with our students as they come in, they get assigned an academic student success coach, and that coach is with them almost weekly contacts for the most at-risk students, but at least a contact every other week during their first semester, and helping build that level of grit that we know is needed to be successful.
There's a great deal of work that suggests that contact, the touch with students, makes a difference. And regardless of their preparation, I know 20 years ago, a friend of mine at Dartmouth was saying she had to contact students every month, even though they weren't her students, or even very well prepared students. We put a small amount of money into San Jacinto College for a call program where work study students were calling other students 2 to 3 times a semester. And it was very successful, and we were surprised that the students' contact, their grades actually improved as well. We just were looking for retention. So there's some things like that individual schools are doing. We need to find a way to ramp those up and make it possible for, number one, everyone to know about it, but also to make decisions in terms of what works best for their students. But University of Houston a few years ago, they didn't have money to ramp it up enough, but actually we've heard about learning communities very often. They take different shapes. They did it based upon where they, as I understood, where they were living in Houston, because there were simple problems in terms of if your car broke down, you could call somebody who lived fairly near you to help you get to school. And the graduation rate for that, the students in those learning communities, was far beyond. I think it was about 20 points higher than most of the student population. UT Arlington did it by department. So there are a number of things. So how do you make these more common? How do you make sure you have the resources in place to do it? And part of it is changing the culture. But there's a lot is known. Now I think we're at the point where we need to think, how does it become the common practice?
One thing to recognize is that a lot of work's been done showing that, in a sense, public colleges and universities as a whole are prepared to serve upper middle class kids. That's what they're prepared to do. And so if you're not middle class, and if you have other things that limit your abilities to participate in the kind of experiences that help you know about college, okay? So, for example, a simple thing, but if you look at most the data I've seen, and you look at African American and Hispanic kids, one of the things is they're much more likely to never have had a sibling that's been through college. Well, and that makes a lot of difference in terms of just knowing what you're going to have to do, knowing what you're going to experience, etc. And one of the things that I continually marvel at, no matter where I am, is that continues to be the model that kind of inherently is used in institutions. And I don't mean everybody sits down and says, let's make it that way. It's the way that the place runs. From professors who look at this and will say, say to a kid, well, we're going to have a special project, and you need to all of you meet at such and such a place at such and such a time. And never ask, are any of you going to have trouble getting there, or etc., because they act like, they're talking about their own kids, or they're talking about middle-class kids. And when you look at our population, it's time we developed a new view of what our average student is like in terms of experience, etc. Because I think whether it's a for-profit or other, we've got to be where the students are, not where our education system was 20 years ago.
Terry, last question.
Did DeVry ever participate in the ATB program? And if it did, does it still now, the Ability to Benefit program for students?
So not DeVry University, never did. Carrington College did at the time that we acquired them. We ceased doing that shortly before. We ceased doing it about a year before, actually, Congress removed Title IV eligibility. So.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your time, your willingness to come to Austin and make this presentation. It's been very helpful.
Thank you.
And I'm going to interrupt one time. Just for your information, we do have career college data on our accountability system for the coordinating board. So you can go out there and look at different career colleges for their individual information. We don't look at first-time, full-time, but we look at persistence rate of first-time at that institution and some of that type of information. So it's already out there on the accountability system.
Okay, now the staff of the coordinating board is going to provide us an overview of what we're going to do in our small group discussions before we retrieve our lunches and begin meeting in about 15 minutes, although I'd like to tighten that up because we're pretty close, but we're running a few minutes behind with that.
I will be brief because I'm standing between you and lunch. Okay, this is the chance y'all been waiting for. Every time we talked about the goals and that sort of thing, you've always wanted to talk about the strategies and things start going to strategies. Today is going to be your chance. You get to talk about the targets, and the one thing we will say is we're going to want measurable targets. And we have provided in your packet, there is some possible targets and possible strategies. The thing for the strategies is they need to be broad because we want to give the institutions the flexibility to serve their type of students that they attract. So we're not necessarily going to be saying everybody has to do it this one way. We're saying everybody has to do it. So those are kind of the examples that we're using.
Would you explain a little bit more what's the purpose of the targets?
Okay, the targets are to look at kind of those things that maybe are not the goal itself, but would help us get to the goal. So let me give you an example. And we also have intermediate targets. The goals are all set for 2030. We need something for 2020, 2025 to make sure we're benchmarking ourselves as we move forward. One of the things when you talk about completion, we want to look at the economically disadvantaged students. So we have a target to make sure that we're not leaving those economically disadvantaged students behind. So that would be a separate target. It's not necessarily the goal, but we need to, that's going to help us. It's not the goal, but it is going to help us get there. So that's kind of where the targets come into play. So,
Do you have operational definitions of each of these factors that we're going to look at in terms of, for example, identified marketable skills?
Yeah, so let me tell you, one thing I've insisted on is that our goals not be definitions.
Okay.
So they're easy. So I'm just putting that on the side. But the staff is, well, if some of these goals would be 20 lines long, if they were, but staff has definitions and is developing definitions that are operational for that purpose. And once you've settled on the targets per se, we will make sure that the definitions are very clear. But the target has to be fairly brief, but to really clearly define them, staff will tell you there are a lot of ifs, ands, and buts that need to go into that. But we will do that. We have to do that. If you go back to closing the gaps, there's a lot sort of in the back that defines those things very well, and over time people know exactly what we're calculating. Marketable skills, in terms of a specific definition, that is challenging, and at some level, at least in terms of staff discussing it, we are not defining that per se, but for the institutions, I think each program should be able to identify what are marketable skills for people in their programs to make sure that they come up with things, that they work with industry to do that. So I think probably, at least from our thinking, what we needed in terms of the definition of marketable skills is how programs would work with, keep in touch with the world to identify what are real marketable skills, and those will change and vary over time, but it's not easy. That's the softest, those are the softest words in all of our goals at this point. And we do have, by the way, we've got a couple students who have been working on this and reviewing the literature who'll be sitting in with that group, and Judith Sebesta from our staff. And so they're going to be working closely with that group. And then Ginger Gossman, one thing we have done is from this point on, we have individual staff who are going to be, their whole focus is going to be on a particular goal, working with you guys, defining things more clearly, doing whatever research is necessary to make this in the next 6 months clearly defined. So those are the type of questions you need to ask today.
And we're set up over here to the left on all 4 committees. Yeah. Food's bye. Everybody can get their food and just head to their table, and we'll try to get started. We have a couple of handouts that are from members of the committee. So if they would like to do their handouts or give it to one of the staff members to distribute. Oh, yeah. I know, Doug, you've got one. I don't know.
Ginger's picking up for me.
Ginger, you've got one?
No,
okay.
Ginger's taking.
Here, give me a hand out.
Yeah, you go that way, and I'll go
Okay, good.
Some more paper.
More paper. We don't like it. Yes.
Doug's doing his.
This is one's. Oh, yeah, this is Shirley Richardson's. Yes.
Okay, let me just take one and then give one to
You want to pass it out?
yeah, we'll pass them out. And who was it? Oh, this was from Shirley. Okay, I would like to reconvene the committee as a whole, and we're going to go through each of the 4 groups, and we're going to ask for Group 1 on educational attainment. Going to look to Susan Brown to present.
Yes, thank you. As far as targets, the group decided what we need to do is do some disaggregation and look at the targets, not only the 60% for the 24 to 30 the 24 to 30, 25 to 34 group, but also look at it by level. So look at the certificates, associate degree, master's and bachelor's, but also disaggregated by gender, ethnicity, and look at it that way, economic status also. So look at it in different ways to make the point better, how we can get there. And as far as strategies, we came up with two that are very broad. One of them goes back to what we talked about earlier, which start earlier to promote post-secondary education, starting in kindergarten or elementary school to create that college-going culture. And then in kind of a subset strategy to that was to work with the current organization, including the legislature, nonprofits, to get that word out. Provide the data so that everybody is speaking in one voice as they go downtown to get the funding and all that is required. You've got to have everybody speaking saying the same thing. It's a lot more effective when you do that. So those were the two big strategies that kind of go overall for this overarching thing.
And we did discuss that by the 60% compares to 38% today. When you add certificates in, we go from 34 to 38%. And the 60% seems pretty ambitious when, if you look at the history of the last 40 years, we've been flat to slightly down. So we essentially first have got to turn the trend line, and then we've got 16 years to close it. It would remind everybody, and we're just focused on the 25 to 34-year-old. On an international basis, the goal is 60% as well, but it's for the total workforce, and it's by 2025. Our national goals are for the U.S. mirror that. So in turn, we're giving ourselves a longer period of time, and we're focused on the part of the workforce that has not yet been educated. So that's where we think we have our greatest opportunity of being able to close the gap. So we're essentially not trying to do it for the 25 to 64-year-old. One thing we didn't talk about, but which I've realized in making a presentation more than a week ago to a business group, is when we target 25 to 34-year-olds, we're not making a statement about adult education or a reentry into the education of those that are already in the workforce. And so we somehow have to work our way, or we need to think through, because that's a very important part of increasing the educational level of the total 25. It might not have a big impact on the 25 to 34-year-old, but what I'm trying to say is we can't discount or leave that part, because it's a very important part to having a competitive workforce. So somehow we have to be able to focus at 25 to 34-year-old without, and still make us, and I don't know where that goal comes, but it needs to be worked in there somewhere, and maybe it's in the next group for the 550,000. I think there's some mention of that. So we need to not lose focus on that, which could be a concern if the focus is all on the 25 to 34-year-old. Okay. Any questions? Or yes, Larry.
Susan used the phrase college-going culture, and I know what you mean, and everybody here does. What has concerned me for a long time is that the public doesn't perceive that right. The public's view of that is 4 years, fraternities and sororities and football. And a lot of people don't think about themselves in that. Well, what we really are aiming at is education after high school. And somehow, I think as this report gets written, the language we use needs to be carefully addressed. We need a phrase. We don't have a phrase, but we need one. And I'll just leave it at that.
Just to echo that, I discovered in a lot of the discussion over the last 5 years, when people in some businesses were saying, you're talking about everybody needs to go to college, everybody, and they all translated into 4-year. And if you talk to them, you discover they really thought a lot of people needed to get certificates at community colleges. And for some reason, they didn't. I mean, it must be exactly what you're talking about, but they were equating it to 4-year institutions, rah-rah, whatever. And we have never intended that. We've thought since Closing the Gaps that 70% of our students really needed to be going to community colleges.
Right, and we talked about
think of better language.
Yeah, we talked about that in our group. That by one, focusing on the workforce, and then two, trying to de-aggregate the demands so that we think this is how many bachelors, how many associates, how many certificates. We begin to answer that question that this is not just about a 4-year degree or a traditional college experience. This is about the workforce, where we see best practices tell us where the demand is going to be and the jobs. And if we don't have that skill level, those jobs will go somewhere else. So I think that's how the way we help deal with that issue.
We actually broke some of those things down since the beginning, but I think it's this more of the marketing effort.
No,
Dr. Faulkner is doing something besides use a different phrase somehow, because we will do that.
I think it's a competitive workforce. I mean, that's
over in Pearsall. I've been working with their school district, and they're calling it college and career ready, so that it encompasses both in readiness rather than college going, because being ready to go to college will get you ready for college or for a good career, as long as you're ready for college.
Well, we got people working on writing this thing, so I'm urging them to think hard.
And we have a great advertising expert here who maybe could help us with that. We do have our college and career readiness standards, but so maybe that would work. But we do need. I think this point is really. It's been a real communication problem that's been coming up in the last few years.
Yeah. Well, it's been used in political terms as well. So, I mean, we've got to have a response there that's very specific to that when that issue is raised. So. Okay, let's move on to Group 2. Julie, are you going to present? Yeah.
I'll just take this. Thank you. Okay, we had a really rich discussion. We started out talking about numbers and percentages, and spent some time just looking at the targets, the possible targets, and thinking about the best ways to show them. And we had the suggestion that showing where we are now so that people can see where we're aiming to be can be helpful. That's both in terms of the goal and the targets. We talked about tracking high school grads, thinking about where they end up, those who graduate and those who don't, and sort of disaggregating some of the data we have for them a little better. Ms. Bricker brought up what do we do if all of this works, if we're successful in reaching this very large goal in terms of almost doubling the number of students we have reaching completion. So we had a good discussion about that, about infrastructure, about whether institutions are ready to increase capacity, about looking historically a little bit at closing the gaps and what did happen when we had institutions that had their numbers really jump, especially in some of the later stages of closing the gaps. We did talk a little bit about online courses and some of the other opportunities for students and where we're going with that. We talked about the educational pipeline, the importance of looking at males and females not only in terms of our completion goals, because we did propose, our completion targets, because we did propose a target that would look at male and female, but also to look at in terms of where we are in the pipeline and coming up through K-12 and what's happening with our men and women and our girls and boys, and thinking about disaggregating that by looking at race, ethnicity, and some of the issues that are challenges there. We talked about a target that would look at dual credit and either thinking about the students who are enrolled in dual credit for out of juniors and seniors, that percent, or overall how many students. We did have a strategy, and we kind of talked about, should we have a strategy around getting high school students participating in college level coursework, or some kind of a target? And I think the consensus was to at least talk about a target a little bit more. We talked about, even with those groups, just the importance throughout all of this, and thinking about looking at the types of students we have involved, looking at involvement of students by race, ethnicity, and Mr. Sosa brought up something. He said, we've got this mindset about demographics, but we need to think about psychographics. And that's really about the reality, the why behind where we are. And that moved us into a conversation that kind of reflected what we were talking about earlier. And that's really the conversation about thinking about a culture that isn't just focused on our upper middle class students. You know, when we were talking earlier, Dr. Faulkner was talking about how higher education has really developed and works most effectively in many ways for those types of students whose families have had experience with higher education, but really to think about the culture of higher education being reflective and supportive of all our types of students in Texas. Okay, we talked about best practices and continue. I think that's it. And then also in terms of strategies, you know, we had some specific things for trying to reach high school students, like having students bring a FAFSA form home when they get the free and reduced lunch forms. And really and again, this goes back to a lot of our conversation about getting a realistic view of where Texas is in terms of educational attainment, where our students are, what our demographics look like. We talked about having a focus, a strategy or a target that aims at increasing GED graduates, and talked about new models for how to reach adults in terms of who have educational challenges. We also talked about partnerships between high school and college and how we can think about those in terms of strategies. We talked a lot about co-requisite courses, developmental education, how we prepare students in high school and then once they enter higher ed, and some of those types of things that are already happening, but how can we encourage continuation of some of those models that accelerate students into college-level coursework, help students move through the system, whether they're in high school and they need extra help or once they move into higher ed. So hopefully I grasped most of that. Okay, are there any questions?
Questions, comments from any of the other committee members? Okay, all right, let's move on to number 3, student debt.
Yes, I think I'm doing that one. The debt goal, as you see, is by 2030, undergraduate student loan debt will not exceed 60% of first-year wage for graduates of Texas public institutions. That's where it is now. So essentially, the debt goal is that things won't get worse for 30 years or 15 years. And our group felt like if we could achieve that, that would be a good thing. Yeah. Of course, it has been getting worse, so this would be a significant achievement. More than that, I think our group felt like this is a good way to focus the attention of the legislature and the public on the financial issues, that the legislature does have concern, the public does have concern with debt, that this is a good measure of how unaffordable higher education is. Let's put it that way. To the degree that it's unaffordable, it shows up in debt. And that keeping an eye on debt and keeping debt under control is a good way to put those issues on the table. The targets, we okayed 1 and 2. 1 and 2 are essentially concordant with the overall goal. The goal is not to let the average debt for students graduating from Texas institutions carrying debt, not to get it worse or let it get worse. And number 1 is not to let it get worse in the 4-year institutions, and number 2 is to not let it get worse in the 2-year institutions. Essentially, keep it at the level that it's in, or it's at in those 2 institutions, 2 sets of institutions. 3, we had some concerns about and spent a lot of time talking about it. This is a pretty technical goal, and we thought maybe it should be rephrased. But basically what it says is that we're setting the goal of doing a progressively better job of fully covering the costs for the neediest students. so that they aren't carrying debt. So we propose that gets done for 43% of the students in 2020, 51% in 2025, and 60% by 2030. Right now, that number is 35%. So we're doing a progressively better job. We need a better way to say that if we're going to do it. The question that really got our committee hung up was, is the cost of doing this going to be to drain dollars out of middle-class students? Well, it shouldn't be, but it could actually happen if we write this down as a target and there's no response in the state grant structure and state grants financing. So the question is, does the committee really want to stay with that? I think it should stay in the picture for the time being, but there's a question about whether it's really wise. It would be good if we could achieve it and not make it really something borne by a subset of our own students as opposed to the state as a whole. The last one, decreasing the semester hours, this is essentially about cutting down on excess hours. We had a lot of discussion about whether these particular goals were realistic, 12, 6, and 3. The biggest questioner was me. In the end, I surrendered. And so I think everyone agrees it's a good idea to put pressure on to try to get students not to waste too much time and to be more efficient. And in fact, to get the institutions to help them be more efficient in getting toward a graduation. We talked about the strategies. Fundamentally redesign higher education funding is something that is needed but would have to originate in the legislature and be supported strongly by the coordinating board. All the other things I think are pretty obvious, except until you get down to 5, employing guided pathways. That essentially is a label for more structured curricula to avoid to help students now, again, to move more efficiently toward a productive end. And then finally, we support experimentation and activity toward finding ways to make baccalaureates more affordable. And I think that's probably all I need to say. Let me ask if the committee members want to say anything more, or the staff members who were with us. Thank you.
Let me ask one question, which maybe this goes to the staff more than the committee, is we differentiate debt based on certificate, associate degree, and bachelor's degree. Presumably, as you add more education, you're adding more income, and thus you'd be your debt level is going to be higher. So why wouldn't you have the same percentage? And so that, I know you got a good answer, but I thought I at least ought to ask that. I mean, because it does get more complicated when you begin to differentiate percentages by level of attainment.
Well, actually, at each level, it's more complicated than it appears. But we are tying this into keeping this at the same level it currently is, but at each level, say, for example, the certificate, there's a broad range. Because we are tying this into the first year earnings. Yeah, the first year earnings. Say at a certificate level, even that could range anywhere from $20,000 to $75,000. And so when you look at that 43% number, I mean that cuts across those levels. We have the same thing at the university level, which is currently about 70%. So you will. I'm sort of dancing around an answer for you, but there are people with a baccalaureate degree, say in psychology, will be earning right now about $23,000. You will have people at the community college level who may be getting a certificate in network management who might be earning $50,000 more than that. But with each level, we're trying to keep it in line, as Dr. Faulkner said, with where we are now. We think that's really our best course now, because there are so many moving parts. How much the legislature is putting in? Do we have enough student grant dollars? And one thing that wasn't mentioned, I don't know if it was on your list, but we had discussed internally, that right now I think it's 57% of our students have debt. We need to have something that we don't increase the number of students who have debt either as a target, if it's not in there, so that one could stay at this 60% level overall, but if now you have 85% instead of 57% of your students have debt, that's not good either. And it may be falling off in the middle class, as you suggest. And so I think somewhere we need a target that addresses that, because I think it can hit at, help us with the middle class number. I don't think I even remotely answered your question.
I guess I'm coming at it from a public policy. Is our policy driven by the amount of debt we want somebody to have to service out of a specific amount of income? Yeah. And as opposed to what it costs for the education or how long they were there, because you could make an argument that that's really it's the debt servicing that it really counts, and we don't want to micromanage the process. We want to send the right signals to people to go pursue degrees that give them the highest payoff in relationship and the amount of debt. And even taking on more debt, if we have a more economically disadvantaged population, I'm not sure that's bad.
Well, and it looks like Paul may have some answers. One thing I do want to say is, from my perspective, part of what you would be accomplishing with this is also that if you keep the debt, if you relate it to that first year income, you open up the possibility of more people to continue to pursue careers as teachers, social workers, various other things, and not to be strictly driven by their income. So in this case, so with the baccalaureate level, the income right now is about $33,000 with a large range. Well, if you with that as a measure, and with that percent of debt, it's really very feasible for a person to still become a teacher. If that. I'm starting, Julie, I'm starting to get into the weeds now.
And I don't want to get the committee at this late.
I always accuse Julie of getting too much into the weeds.
Yeah. Okay. We don't need to go any farther. Larry's got a comment he wants to make.
I'll tell you exactly the answer.
All right.
The reason the percentages are different is because when you graduate with a baccalaureate degree, your increase in revenue over the 10-year period after you graduate is more than when you finish with an associate's degree. You don't tend to see as much of an increase over a 10-year period in your salary.
Right. So, another way to say that, if you took 10 years worth of, if you took 10 years worth of income, really, and measured your loan against that, the percentage that the bachelor's degree would drop dramatically, or closer. It would drop closer to where you are with the associate degree.
I think so.
Okay.
And obviously, if you're taking 4 years to get your bachelor's degree, you're probably going to be borrowing more as you move through. So those numbers are going to be a little higher when you come out. But then we see a leveling off because you see the increase in the salary for those with the bachelor's and a leveling off with those with associates over time.
That's right. I can understand your question.
Right. Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to make one point that I forgot when I was doing it. Our group also talked about the issue of debt being piled up by people who don't ever achieve a productive end in the form of a degree or a certificate. And in fact, this debt goal only addresses people who graduate, really. And Jerry, I think, raised the point that students shouldn't explore on debt. And that happens to a large degree, actually, for students who are first-time college attendees, brand new, maybe the first in the family. Students who are coming into our institutions are looking around, seeing what they're going to do. This happens especially at community colleges, but they're borrowing money from the very beginning, and the yield from that is often negative for them. And so we actually talked a little bit about whether it would be possible to lay some emphasis, maybe not inside this goal because of the way it's phrased, but lay some emphasis on whether we could create a system where students don't borrow for at least their first semester, and community colleges are four-year institutions. I don't know whether there's a way to control that or a way to discourage it, but I think it has really negative impact. And I thought the way Jerry phrased it was very productive.
Related to that, I don't know if Paul knows this, but I think some of our student services staff would know, but my impression is the middle class are more likely to borrow, at least at universities, sooner because that's more likely to be part of their package. And so we may want to look specifically at the data on that. I know at private schools, many of the students, the bulk of their need package is actually loans, not grants per se.
Yeah, that's true. Probably the phenomenon that I have concern about is more of a community college phenomenon, and it's about students trying out what this is all about and whether I can do any good with it. I just hate to see those students walk away with nothing but debt.
And it fits with the conversation this morning that's a factor in the for-profits especially.
Right.
And we actually looked at some data and saw that there were, Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, there are a lot of, in terms of the students who are defaulting, the highest level tends to be students with fairly low debt levels, but they're students who did not stay. We looked at some data for students who didn't graduate, and the students who were just there a semester or two often were the ones who are more likely to default, even though their loan amounts are smaller compared to those who complete.
In one of the presentations that was made, I think last month, somebody mentioned better counseling at the beginning so they could choose a major that they would enjoy and be good at so that they would not be changing majors and therefore staying longer in school and piling up debt by the fact that so many students change a major more than once. Okay, great, thanks.
Okay, so Larry, that leads into marketable skills.
Before you go on, Woody, I'd just like to make one more comment. I hate to drag this on, but you know, the amount of debt you accumulate depends on how long you're accumulating it. And I think one of the major things in here is to get away from this idea that 12 credits is a full load and that 6-year completion is a norm. And we've just got to get a new mindset in here, is that no, we need to get out of here in 4 years, and you need to divide that number of credits by whatever it takes to get there.
6 years is the norm. It's called a master's degree.
So I didn't see that explicitly in here, but I do think that's a factor. I mean, there is a thought that, well, you know, nobody really looks down on 6 years anymore because that's kind of seems by what the measure is.
Okay, thank you, Bob. We'll go on to marketable skills. Who's going to present? Ginger?
I'd like to invite my lovely assistant.
The future of higher education.
So our group was tasked with discussing marketable skills, which when you review the targets and strategies, it seems like, oh, thank you. Seems like that may be the easier of the 4 goals to discuss because we don't have targets that have numbers in them. When in fact, is this a microphone? When in fact, it is one of the harder, it is, I think, the harder goal to discuss because of that. So we began our conversation really talking about marketable skills and what are they. And that is something that is going to be an ongoing conversation, and it's going to be part of the strategies where institutions will have to collaborate within and across institutions, within and across the stakeholders to try and figure that out. Talking about the goal, it's by 2030, all graduates from Texas public institutions of higher education will have completed programs with identified marketable skills. Our group decided that that was not sufficient, that the goal should really read something like the students will graduate or will have completed programs with demonstrated and identified marketable skills. So that's going to change our strategies a little bit as we move forward and think about this.
Let me grab number 2. We did talk through the targets, even though we spent a lot of time talking about what is a marketable skill, which just demonstrated to us as staff that that's the conversation we need to keep having. We talked through the targets, thanks to the leadership of Mr. Lyle, who pushed us through. And everyone seemed to think that the targets were well worded and were reasonable, although we needed to more explicitly state that these marketable skills would not just be developed and updated, but there would be communicated to students, and that needs to be embedded in the targets more readily. In the strategies, we talked about things like certifying students in their marketable skills, or perhaps in a family of marketable skills, having students use their career counseling centers, maybe make that a requirement, developing better internship opportunities for students, and also putting perhaps on each syllabus in a course, putting on there the marketable skills that students should walk away with when they're done with the course or when they've completed it successfully. And we also talked about marketable skills as part of the core, as the core curriculum, and making that more explicit to students that when they complete a certain course, that they are walking away, or they should be walking away with a set of marketable skills. So those are the strategies that we talked about. But again, we recognize that this is going to be a conversation that's ongoing. And we talked through the strategies that were proposed and looked at a way that we could perhaps collapse some of them or combine some of them. And we felt like some of the strategies in here were perhaps not appropriate for a statewide strategy, but would be more strategies that institutions or individual institutions might elect to execute.
Bernie? Just like to thank the 2 students who participated in our group. I don't happen to know their names, but if they just stand up and state their names. We have Beta, thank you. Beta. Thaddeus. So, let's see. Beta she came up with the great idea of using the carrot or the stick to get the kids into the career counseling centers. Okay, right now it's like, they built it and they assume that the kids will come. So we need to encourage that. And then Thaddeus came up with a great one. He came up with the adding the marketing skills to the syllabus. So all the syllabus objectives are not marketable necessarily, so there would be a distinction there.
Any more questions? Okay, well, I think we've had a very productive day. I want to particularly thank, this is that's said at the very beginning, it's our 7th meeting. I want to thank everyone for staying the course. Bob and I had a brief discussion at lunch that we think that we're getting traction and momentum. I think we're beginning to narrow and focus. We've still got a ways to go, but I felt very encouraged that we're making good progress. And Dr. Faulkner and I, appreciate everybody's willingness to stay the course here and be here every month. As I said earlier, we'll look at December because we've only got one date on the calendar right now, and if that it's not acceptable to enough people, and I'll talk to staff, we've of course got November, and for some, maybe even an opportunity to be twice in November to come to the coordinating board's convening. But so December, I think, is still a question, and then we would restart in January, and then we'll have a race to the finish line to be able to deliver a report by the June-July time period. So I want to thank everybody. A very good meeting, and I'll see you in November.
Great. Good meeting.